to Still We Rise, Navigating Race and Religious Identity in the Academy. We're so happy to have you here with us today. My name is Dr. Meredith Hope, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan. Trained as a developmental psychologist, I study the ways in which religious communities contribute to the health outcomes of Black youth and young adults who are exposed to high-risk environments such as racial discrimination and community violence. I've been in the academy, or the ivory tower, as some would like to call it, for the last 13 years, and I hope to spend my career strengthening my professional and chosen communities as an equity-driven researcher, teacher, and advocate for others. I'll be serving as the moderator for this session. And so let's get this session started. I'll turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves alphabetically.
Hey everyone, my fault. I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Dr. Donte Bernard. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Medical University of South Carolina. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm really excited to be here, especially on Juneteenth in remembrance of those who've came before us and in honor of this special day. My program of research broadly seeks to understand how and why racial discrimination negatively impacts the mental health of Black youth, in efforts to identify tangible strategies and mechanisms that can be targeted within psychological intervention. Specifically, my research aims to examine the traumatic and psychological consequences of racial discrimination, which extends to capture feelings of the imposter syndrome, in addition to culture-specific risk and protective factors that may strengthen or buffer the deleterious effects of racial-related stress and trauma. That can be targeted. Specifically, my research aims to examine the traumatic and psychological consequences of racial discrimination.
Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Danielle Busby. I am an assistant professor at Baylor's College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. I've been in this position for just 8 months now, and much of my research really focuses on suicide risk and prevention among adolescents, as well as barriers to care, specifically among Black college students who are at elevated risk for suicide. I also have work that's really specific to how traumatic experience impact Black adolescents. And I'm really excited to be here as well. And thank you for having me on the panel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Lauren Hammond-Ford. I earned a degree in history and African American studies at the University of Virginia, and a PhD in Latin American history at the University of Texas at Austin. Currently, I'm an assistant professor at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, while I'll be starting my 5th year this starting fall. In the wider Quad Cities community, I am a scholar, a teacher, an activist, as well as a faith practitioner. And currently, I have been serving as the advisor for Augustana College's Black Student Union, and I'm also the co-founder of the Black Faculty and Staff Advisory Committee at Augustana College.
Hello and welcome. Happy Juneteenth, or Black Emancipation Day. My name is James Holly Jr. I am an assistant professor at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, in the teacher education department with a specific focus on urban STEM education. So I do a lot of work with pre-service teachers and trying to help them understand how to teach the STEM disciplines with the consciousness to the racism and other oppressive systems in our society. So helping them understand how to adhere to the content standards while also using culture as a context and race and social dynamics.
And hello, happy Juneteenth. My name is Chauncey Smith. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development. My program home there is our Youth and Social Innovation major. And broadly, my work centers the school experiences and socio-political development of Black youth, specifically as it relates to race, gender, and the voice that speaks to it all. I'm happy to be here. Happy Juneteenth.
Yusuf, unmute yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all to all the panelists, for Meredith for organizing, and for all the guests who are joining us via the web. My name is Yusuf Ransom. I am an assistant professor at Yale School of Public Health in the Department of Social Behavioral Sciences. My research looks at religion, faith, spirituality, and social cohesion in ways to reduce health disparities, specifically focused on alcohol use disorder, HIV, and type 2 diabetes. Thank you all, and I look forward to sharing amongst my panelists today experiences as a Black academic of faith.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Now I'll be sharing with you how the session will go on from here. There are a few pre-written questions, and our panelists will take turns sharing their insights and expertise with us. I encourage the panelists to keep their remarks to under 2 to 3 minutes, as we have a lot to say. To you, our audience, we'll be talking about quite a bit today, and so we anticipate that you'll have questions, and lots of them. During the session, I ask that you text your question to 734-531-7317. At the end of our session, there will be time for us to answer your questions. The session is being recorded with live transcription. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. The first question is, religion and faith play a significant and long-standing role in Black narratives. What's your narrative around being Black and a person of faith?
I'll jump in here. So interestingly, I was watching the program earlier today, and they were explaining how during initial celebrations of Juneteenth, they were essentially prayer meetings, and folks sang songs and wore new clothes to represent their newfound freedom. And so I just think that there's a thread throughout history of what you just said. And so for me, my Christian identity deepened and became rich when I understood Black history better, in particular Black racial history. And so for me, there's two aspects of my narrative. One is enriching and broadening our theology to understand that racism, right, is within the theological and bibliocentricity. Like, that's an issue that is of deep concern to God and is not some extra thing. And so that's what the space I operate in, but also trying to reconcile the concepts of spiritual liberation and carnal or human liberation that were separated through theology with chattel slavery. And so we saw Christians, folks who, claim to be followers of Christ, create this separation ideologically, but also like in manifestation between being spiritually liberated and being physically liberated, so that they can sustain the chattel slavery system, right? And then we form this country under that. And so my narrative is, once I realized how that was broken and how that's not the essence of authentic Christianity, with me forming my own identity and also being an ambassador and minister of that same truth.
Would anybody like to follow up or follow that up?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll jump in as well. I think for me personally, I will also echo what James has mentioned in that my spirituality and my faith strengthened as my racial identity strengthened. I think as I grew up in the church, it was always important to me, but I didn't really quite understand what was being said until I understood my own journey and the journey of those who came before me. And understanding really what the Bible says, not only about unity and reconciliation, but also about what it says about who I am and who I am in Christ. I think all of those came together for me to really help me understand my place in this world, and also the journey that he has put me on today.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. Would anybody else like to chime in on this question?
I guess I'll just add that for me, when I was developing my religious identity, it really actually came from my family really being forward about and being really intentional about how they socialized me around race and how they socialized me around just experiences that my father is from Mississippi. He was born in 1948. So all of those experiences that he had, those kind of led a lot of my socialization and my narrative. And I always felt like in many ways, spirituality, faith, religiosity was all tied within my culture. And so that would kind of explain pieces of my narrative.
Thank you. Dr. Hammond?
Yeah, so I'll echo some of the comments of my co-panelist, particularly that which centers Black history. So I'm actually a historian and a historian of the African diaspora, and believe that for people of color, particularly Black people, we have an innate ability to be able to connect with those who are marginalized, those who find themselves on the edges of society. And I think that's an important thread that we actually see through the gospel, because Jesus was someone who was very much concerned with those who were orphans, right? Those who were widows, those who were the poor. That is primarily who Jesus went to, and not the people who were in power, the people who were in the establishment, right? So if you think about the way that Jesus kind of works through the Gospels, one of the things that we see is that he often criticized Pharisees, experts in the law, teachers, scribes, and instead turn to the everyday experiences of average, everyday Jewish people and others, right? The Samaritan woman, as well as the Syro-Phoenician woman, in terms of thinking through how these people needed healing, needed justice, and also needed the opportunity to be heard. So I think African Americans have an ability to connect with that in a way that perhaps some other groups don't.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond. Anybody else?
I'm happy to jump in here. Much like everyone here, right? I think we all know the lingo and can think about the ways in which our racial identity and spiritual identity are intersected. So for me, my racial, spiritual, and professional identity, academic identities, they're all actually intersected. And they were all honed and cultivated because I'm a native AT alien. So I was raised in Atlanta. And so much of that is grounded in the church, right? My ATLian Black experience is grounded in the church. So what I saw was a church that was doing something that I came to know as racial socialization, but they were doing it beautifully. And from there, I got really excited about youth ministry and just kind of like what was happening, not necessarily just the message, but the ways that my youth ministry and youth choir directors were interacting with us. And so from there, I got really, really excited about this, what I came to know as youth development. And then my career kind of launched from there. And so I'm happy to speak to that more. But I think all those things are, I'm lucky to have those things intersected and to be very organic that way. Thanks.
Awesome. Any other thoughts, Dr. Ransom?
Yeah, thank you. So one thing I'll add to, and I think I sort of bring in a third layer of intersection, which is sort of immigrant identity, right? And I think my faith developed a lot from seeing my mom, coming to the United States and having to navigate being an immigrant, but also being a Black person. And, coming here without a social support network, or certainly a smaller social support network, she's had to figure out ways of moving forward. And there's often no manual that comes with being an immigrant, right? You sort of have to learn this process. And one of the things that she has practiced is sort of that walk by faith, right? Just recognizing that you've taken that step to come to a country that's different, to navigate a system that is different, but also having that intense belief and faith that that things are going to work out in a way that's expected, right? We have this expected end, and we have to walk with it. And so I've picked up a lot from that journey, and that has influenced how I have walked throughout my life. And so just, again, adding that perspective to what everyone else has said, that is something that we have all observed either through family or through our readings and our understanding of culture. So definitely family, it seems like it's quite central, and we all have had that experience where people have led by example.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to go into our second question. So many scholars do not identify as religious or people of faith. In addition, depending on the discipline, the background, and any other individual factors, academic circles can be perceived as hostile or as unsafe spaces to be both a person of color and a person of faith. What is your experience so far? I'll open it up to anybody who wants to chime in.
So I'll jump in here, and in a way that is somewhat similar to Yusuf. I think that maybe I might bring a somewhat different perspective, in the sense that although I identify as a Black Christian, I was not traditionally Black churched. So I did not spend my youth going to African American churches every Sunday, was not necessarily raised in that tradition. And so for me, a lot of what I was able to learn actually came through interaction with predominantly white churches and parachurch organizations. So I think I might be perhaps a bit unique in that sense. But I actually came to faith in the academy. So I was introduced to the faith kind of with the top level sense as a young child, as many people are, but didn't really come to a saving faith until I was in graduate school during the final years of my PhD program. And so what was interesting for me there was that God knows how we are equipped and how he has created us as individuals. And so I've always had a deep love for reading and also had a deep love for the discipline of history. And so God used both of those things to draw me by his spirit to being a Christian. So suddenly I had an interest in reading the scriptures that had never been there before. And God also led me to materials that proved to me the veracity of the scriptures, right? That often had to do with the ways in which the Bible was constructed as a historical text. And so for me, my coming to Christ was very much rooted in the academy, right? In all of the ups and downs, right? As we were being tested and tried, right? As we write our dissertations and whatnot. But also the fact that I was trained as a historian has given me perhaps a different set of tools in terms of how I examine the Bible as a critical historical text. And that was also one of the things that the Holy Spirit used to draw me.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond. Would anybody else like to respond to the question about academic circles being perceived as hostile or perhaps unsafe? Feel free to chime in with any stories or experiences that you've had in your answer.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. I think for me, especially within the discipline of clinical psychology, we're often told to keep, our own beliefs and our own perceptions outside of academia. But I think my God tells me to shine my light, right? Like in Matthew 5:14, how he tells us that we can't hide our spirituality or our faith, but let it shine on top of the hilltop so everyone can see it, right? So I am a little bit unapologetic when it comes to my faith and spirituality, whether that be praying, at big get-togethers and letting folks ask, like, "Are you okay, Donte? What's going on?" I'm like, "I'm just praying. That's all. I bless my food before I eat." Or asking folks, in clinical domains, tell me about your own spirituality. Tell me how that influences whatever's bringing you in today. I think we can bring our own faith and spirituality in our domains to actually help us do the work we're doing. I think we're called to do that and called to spread the gospel, whatever we're doing. And I think that's something that's always motivated me and continues to fuel what I do, and also serves as a resilience factor for me, despite the stress and everything that's going on. So I think it's always something that I rely on, even though the academy may not be the most welcoming of it at times.
Great. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll add, I'm also a clinical psychologist. And so I think particularly in a therapy room, you are taught to kind of leave your beliefs to be separate. And I think what I had to really learn to do and figure out how to make it so that I can still bring my whole self into the room. Because I honestly feel like I do my work the best. If that's research, if that's clinical work, I do whatever work I'm doing best when I'm my most authentic self. And so that's going to be inclusive of all my identities. And so I think for me, it's been about keeping true to that, but then also, like Donte said, kind of pulling in my patients or people I work with, what are the things you believe, and trying to understand where maybe there are intersections, even if there are differences.
Excellent. All right, if anybody else wants to chime in, otherwise we'll go to question number 3.
I'll chime in.
Go ahead.
Dr. Hammond, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say very briefly that I also maybe have a somewhat unique experience, and that I'm actually at a small liberal arts college that has a religious affiliation. And so that's given me a unique opportunity to actually talk openly with colleagues about faith, about the Bible, to read classic spiritual texts. But I think I bring a particular benefit to those discussions as often the only person of color, and definitely always the only Black Christian who's participating in those types of discussions.
Thank you.
So yeah, as a person of color, absolutely. The Academy tries to bear down on and drain my spirit hourly. and I knew that was going to be the case as my mentors were kind of training me in undergrad. And I got a preview of it in high school. And so, but you know, you're never trained for the hourly violence. Nonetheless, what's interesting is I'm actually trained as an educational psychologist, and my first intro to ed psych class in undergrad was really powerful. I went to Morehouse, which was really cool, to go to an HBCU, to be in Atlanta, to be trained by Black psychologists. Like, it was a huge privilege because day one of my ed psych class, the professor says, great, let's break down these words. Educational psychology, psyche equals spirit. Educere means educate. That means educate means to draw out. So she said, like, so when we talk about educational psychology, it is the science of drawing out the spirit. When I tell you that set me free from day one, and I never got messed up around what it is that I was doing and how I am moving about the earth. So yeah, so I think that was my introduction to the science, and I felt really liberated by that. And so, you know, I think my faith community has grown and kind of evolved over the years. I will be fair and credit the Academy for one thing when it came to kind of expanding my faith and really kind of strengthening it and bolstering it up, is that it facilitated my clinical analytical skills, right? So when I started to think about the text with the same respect that I thought about Macbeth or some nonsense, you know, or when I was reading about racial identity, when I started to think about the story of Christ in that way, it opened up my world, and I think it helped me to be an even stronger believer. It helped me to decolonize my faith because in middle school I looked more like a white evangelical, and then over time, you know, that I started to liberate my theology, and so that has been my journey in the Academy, which is a little different. Hopefully very common for HBCUs, but yeah, so wanted to share that.
Thank you. And we will have a time at the end where people will be able to share anything else that they'd like to, as things come up. Our third question is.
Well, I want to
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just waiting for folks. So I definitely agree that there's a general hostility to religion, but I think there's also a specific hostility to Christianity. I think there's a misunderstanding that Christianity, like as people are calling out different forms of oppression, different things, there's a idea that Christianity is a white person's religion, or is it tied to whiteness? And so, like, I think one of the tensions that I have is, like, when people think Christianity, they think of America as a Christian nation, like whatever that means. It's hard to have those conversations to disband and unpack and say, no, like that corrupted form of Christianity was used for a particular reason, but that's not the Christianity of the Bible. Right. And so I think there's some tension that I navigate there. I also think that for me, my identity in the Academy, like it is different in terms of the why and the to what extent. So like I'm in the Academy because of my faith, right? If it was up to me, I literally doing my PhD, I said I'd never be a professor. And yet here we are. And so I think that the Lord used the opportunity to advance in the higher educational space to think through how to serve people outside of a ministerial context in a ministerial way, right? Like, so working with education, work with pre-service teachers, the schools, particularly public schools, but K-12 schools in general, are places of trauma for many Black youth. And so, you know, like not everybody goes to the church house. So we have to have another way through our work, through utilizing our skill sets and gifts to serve this group and people in general, right? Education is a huge thing, and it goes beyond even the school. And so I also see it in terms of, you know, things like justice, diversity, and so on. Like, why I pursue those things are rooted in biblical theology, right? So no justice, no peace is literally a biblical chant, right? It's not just a political thing or activism thing, right? And that's not to demean those, because I think in many ways activists are much further in being honest and challenging those issues. And so, you know, for me, it's the why I do certain things and to what extent. Like, I don't just do it in my research, write papers, and then turn it off when I go home. I have to live this 24/7, you know, and so that really shapes the way that I engage the Academy, and even being Black in the situation I have to navigate there, it's my faith that reinforces me to stay when I want to go.
Thank you, Dr. Holly.
I would,
All right, so we're going to transition to our third question. Given the nature of what we do in our fields and in the different positions we have, and our positionality as early career scholars of color, many of us are often at increased risk to experience mental health issues. Does your religious practice or tradition or spirituality contribute to your perspective on mental health?
So I'm going to jump in on that one. And absolutely would be the first answer. And when I first saw that question, I think the first thing that really came to my mind is just that in so many ways, my faith is so integrated within how I think about mental health. And I think a lot of times when we think about mental health interventions or think about certain things that we do within treatment, so much of it overlaps with guidance that's provided, like within the Bible, and not even just within the Christian faith, like across different faiths, right? So like this idea of having faith, I mean, even if you're thinking about in treatment, like how do we like sit in the gray? How do you kind of deal with things and kind of have this peace about things without having all the answers? And I think so many parts of like just who, like how we kind of go about intervening in some things are so wrapped up in things that we are, I feel like that is, you know, I've learned through my faith. And I think in a lot of ways, that is sort of always tried to like be teased apart. And we want to say, like, you know, Christianity is this one way of being, and it's like just it's a religious belief, but it's so different from what we're doing within intervention. And I think there's so much overlap.
Thank you, Dr. Busby. Would anybody else like to follow that up? How has the academy hurt you as you navigate the different goals that you are pursuing through your different disciplines, tasks, goals?
I'll hop in again since y'all sitting back. Yeah, so for me, I'm on a tenure track position, right? And so being in education, like the field of education, while also in the space of higher education, the tenure process is not set up for people to actually learn and for you to do well, right? It's a particular way that it's set up that burns you out. And so I have this book, How the Black Academic's Guide to Winning Tenure Without Losing Your Soul. And so part of the reason why I didn't want to be an academic, because I felt as if I had to give up my values to actually remain within the academy. And so as I look at what the best things that researchers have shown, and even history has shown, what's best for all people to learn, and in particular Black people, the academy does the opposite. You know, it's really anti that. It has this business model. It has this way of like, I have to focus on my research and not necessarily being an excellent teacher, but after I get tenured, then I can focus on being an excellent teacher. But right now it's about being an excellent researcher and scholar. And so, you know, there's this thing where it's like, you have to do these three things, teach, research, and serve in service. But if we're honest, like we know most of the weight is on research, right? Because that brings in dollars. And so there's this game that we are to navigate as Black people in America that is an additional load placed upon you. And you have to say like, Lord, is you sure? Like, is this really where I'm supposed to be? Because this is a 6-year, you know, hustle, if you will, right? A 5-year, 6-year grind, sometimes 7 years. And, you know, you got folks saying your family has to just get on board. They have to be willing to put on the side your passions, your ministry, your mental health essentially has to. And so now we're finding ways to exist in spite of, right? That still we rise. We have to find ways on top of everything else of being Black. In addition, like they didn't want us in this space. It took so much to get into this space, and you have extra work that you have to do on top of it. And so there's a lot of this game of this is what the goal is, and then you get that, and then it moves, and then it moves again. And so that's all this extra load bearing that it really takes the Lord to help you navigate to be in a place of wellness and contentment and peace and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Holly. I'd like to follow up on that question that just came to me. You mentioned something about extra work. What does extra work look like when we're thinking about the intersection of not only racial identity, religious identity, and then also this mental health within the academy? Like what is the extra work?
So I'll jump in here and follow up with James. That was a really excellent way to sort of describe some of the pressures of academia. First is that we give up a lot, right? There's often a lot that we have to put in to get the dissertation done. There are family events that we got to miss out. Sometimes we have attended schools like way far away from our family network, and so we are not only alienated within our social support, but also specifically being around folks of color, or even having that sort of religious community to identify with. But the second thing I would say that perhaps sometimes is a source of like real tension, and you got to be able to have a element of faith to be able to buffer that, is the fact that you are often the person in your department or school that are really working on issues of health disparities, right? And so when you think of the monumental task that you're put forth to try to change, right? And I'll just sort of give a concrete example. Recently, I just submitted a grant to look at religion and spirituality and reducing type 2 diabetes disparities. And one of the data points was showing that in the past 10 or 15 years, there hasn't been any progress or any differences in the Black-white gap in the prevalence of diabetes, right? So here, I coming out as a junior professor thinking that, no, this is my challenge, right? Recognizing that there were many people who came before me, many researchers who tried to tackle this issue. And for whatever reason, again, the disparities has not changed over the past 10 years, right? So how do you come in now realizing that you have something significant to offer and trying to jump in a fight that, again, hasn't changed for quite some time? So it does give you an elevated sort of perspective that you have a lot to do. You have a lot of people that are looking forward for you to be successful. And I'll close with saying, when I have been in some low points where I'm trying to figure out, am I really going to have an impact? One of the things that a close friend of mine reminded me is that, we shouldn't be weary in doing good, right? And just about 2 weeks ago, I've had that moment where it's been really weary, again, especially trying to crank out those pages to convince a panel of NIH reviewers that you should be funded to do this important work. You can sometimes become weary, recognizing that it's a huge battle. So I think having that perspective of faith and having others around you to comfort and to share that support is really important as we do this work, because for many of us in our fields, we do face a monumental task of reducing health disparities and whatever outcome that we are focused on, whether it be education, health, mental health. So we need that perspective that keeps us grounded.
Thank you, Dr. Ransom.
If it's okay, I'll jump on that as well.
Sure, Dr. Bernard, go for it.
So I think Yusuf and James really hit it home, and that word weary really sticks with me, especially when we're considering, the recent events that have happened in our country and the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, among countless others. And when you talked about the idea of that extra work or extra burden that we have, I think not only are we dealing with these expectations to fill these big gaps that exist in research or within departments that don't do the work that we do, while also trying to reprioritize our lives that, to get it right, there's also this expectation from other Black folks who look like us, who are coming after us to help lift them up as well. So this idea of, this Black tax or this cultural tax to help lift up others while also trying to somehow manage the time to get everything right so you can also lift as we climb, as we say it. And I think it's a very, very hard expectation to put on, and it's something that's not really given the proper acknowledgement when it comes to promotions, when it comes to tenure reviews, when it comes to journal articles, when it comes to any of these things that are typically seen as currency in our field. And I think that makes it very, very challenging to establish, well, what do I need to do? Because we know that there are others in our own lives who have stepped in for us, who have done the same thing, right? So it's this constant ebb and flow of giving while also taking, while also acknowledging that part of me is, being put into everything that I'm doing here. So it's this constant, at least for me, evaluation of where I'm at. So to wrap it up, back to your first question of the idea of mental health, my mental health is very much tied into my spiritual health. So for me, if I find myself not going to church, or if I find myself not praying, or if I find myself not doing the things that tell me that I'm good spiritually, that has a direct impact, not only on me spiritually and physically and mentally, but also academically and professionally and personally as well. So these are all connected in ways that I don't think folks who don't share our same experiences from time to time don't quite connect with.
You're muted.
You're muted, Meredith.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, we're back on track. Okay, so I'd like to hear from some other people. What does being mentally healthy and thriving in academia look like for you as well? I'd like to hear about a few more experiences. What does that look like for you?
I think a lot of it is a lot of prayer. A lot of prayer, a lot of time spent in the Word, a lot of time grounded in community and connected to others who have a hunger for God and a willingness and desire to grow. I find that as I get older and older and I do this thing longer and longer, that those who are in my most immediate circle are those who have a real heart for God. And even as I think about being a part of the academy, in many ways, I approach this as a ministry, right? So I'm not only trained as a history professor and do teaching, right? But I also minister as a Bible teacher. And so for me, in many ways, it's a holistic thing where it becomes, as many others have said, difficult to separate this spiritual from whatever other aspects of life, whether it be professional or social. And so, as we're being tested and tried in many of these different areas, right? If we think about things like hidden labor, imposter syndrome, etc., I find that those are the times where I have to lean into the Word. And it's also really an opportunity for me to give God room for me to trust Him, right? As I move through, I'm also a tenure track, right? So as I move through the tenure process, as I think about research in a field that is primarily single authored, right, where I will often be required to write a book, things that are very, very long-term projects. I have to keep my eye and sight on Him every step of the way, because if I don't, I'll get lost in the mix and I will find myself falling off track. So I would say a lot of it, again, is prayer, being in the Word, and making sure that I'm rooted in a community of believers.
Thank you for sharing. I have a question for Dr. Busby. As a clinical psychologist, what advice might you give to those watching who would be hesitant or feel a stigma to incorporate therapy into their lives, given that so many people, not just in the Black community, but in other communities, may feel a stigma around, being in church or being in synagogue, mosque, but also wanting to be just like, so could you speak to that?
Yes, I can. So, what advice I would give. So first, I think whenever you have this hesitant nature to ask why, so stigma could be one of the reasons, but I think there are so many different reasons that people hesitate to actually seek treatment, particularly in the Black community. When we think about mistrust from health providers, whatever. So I actually think it's important to first check in with yourself and acknowledge, whatever you're feeling makes sense, and whatever you're feeling, is real. And so I think after kind of assessing what your main, concern is, to investigate. I think it's appropriate to, when you go to a provider, to have a series of questions you really want to ask or know where they stand on. I think it's also appropriate that if it's really important for your provider to be someone that, is of your same religious faith, or at least is comfortable integrating spirituality within treatment, that's something that you can always, bring forth to your provider. Or even issues of race. I lived in a predominantly white city, and I was looking for a psychologist who was Black, and I was having trouble. And so when I went to see someone who wasn't of the same racial background as me, I just kind of flat out was like, are you comfortable with talking about these types of issues? Because they're going to come up. And those are some of the reasons that, I'm, even talking about my own journey, that's why I'm here. So I think transparency is always transparency with your provider or with yourself, and, checking in around what is it that is really your concern, so you could do something about it, because you do have agency in that process.
Thank you, Dr. Busby. All right. Oh, we have another one. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I'll chime in on the question about like mental health and what does that look like while negotiating a thriving, I guess, routine in the academy. And it looks like standing appointments with my therapist. Shout out to Dr. Busby's words of wisdom, right? So standing weekly appointments with my therapist. It looks like long walks where I just cry out to God, by myself. It looks like the group chat with other faculty of color where I get to kind of reduce some of that cognitive load, which is often taken up by one single question. Am I crazy or is it ... right? It's helpful to have that long meals where we start at 6 p.m. and close down the restaurant with other folks who get it, and we laugh and we talk and we cry, we share, we vent. That's what mental health and negotiation looks like. So it's kind of a thriving in the academy, but also a thriving in the spirit. And I would encourage everyone to find the routine that works for you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. All right, if there aren't any others, we'll just go on and move to our next question. This is really great stuff here today. I hope that everybody is so far who's joining us is really learning a lot. I know I am. All right, so when we look at the numbers, Black Americans remain severely underrepresented in the academy, and as well as in other places outside of the academy as well, despite some steps to recruit and retain scholars of color. So what does that mean? In what ways does your faith identity inform how you navigate racism and other forms of stigma and oppression in your work and in academic spaces at large?
So I'll start off with this one here. I think it's a complex question, right? Because there are many forms of oppression that we experience. I know racism and stigma are sort of the most visible forms, but I think part of it is, and many of our colleagues have mentioned, which is really searching for who you are and trying to figure out a way that your identity really shows forth in directing your path, right? And so this is quite personal to me, and I'll share how I think about these specific issues by first of all understanding who you are, right? So I think James touched on this earlier in terms of identity. And so for me, the translation of my name in English means Joseph, right? And only recently I've sort of really spent time understanding the story of Joseph, right? Begins in Genesis chapter 36, goes through chapter 50, and really shows a person who's been through so many forms of oppression from an early age, right? As a teenager, being sold into slavery, being, first selected by a leader, but then having to be thrown into prison, only to much later on be called for to lead a nation and its people. So several things that can be learned from that story, right? And again, there's been so many different gems that you can take out of it, but one of the things to highlight is that under or in these positions where you are experiencing oppression, there's often a blessing. First, there's a blessing that perhaps you can bring to others, right? By, again, many of you may not know the story, but while in prison, Joseph was able to bless so many of the people in prison at that time to sort of get, develop their faith, develop a new experience. There's sometimes a blessing that you bring to others indirectly. So the scripture also shows that like Potiphar, the person who bought Joseph, he was blessed because of Joseph, right? And so I think, in those experiences, it's allowed me to really reflect on, one, why is this particular oppression taking place? Two, what specifically am I supposed to be learning from this? And three, how am I to come out of this into providing some type of assistance, some type of help to people who are also experiencing trauma? Because one of the things we've learned is that sometimes the people who are doing the oppression themselves are at some point in their life have experienced some type of oppression, right? So how do we navigate that space? And I think really it comes back to figuring out how you identify as a person and really just being grounded in faith and just being honest, seeking the word of the Lord when you are confused or when you don't have the right answers, and just giving it time to develop. But there's always something within the oppression that we need to learn and we need to be able to come out from and share with others. So that's kind of how I navigate being in those spaces, right? And I think it's been pretty helpful for me so far.
I'd like to hear from somebody else. Thank you, Dr. Ransom.
So I'll speak maybe briefly to that. And one of the things that I've often thought about, I'm a lover of the prophets. So in particular, I love the book of Isaiah, which I'm sure some people may be like, that's weird, right? One of the things that we can think about in terms of prophetic voices is that they were always called by God to speak the truth. And so one of the things that I find is that as a Black person in the academy, and in my particular institution, I am one of 4 out of a faculty of well over 100 people. I find myself often in the position to be able to speak prophetically, right? In the sense that I'm often one of the few people who is willing to speak truth to power, to ask difficult questions, and to ask about people who otherwise may be marginalized. And so, I'm sure, and you ask colleagues, right? Some of them will say, I'm always asking questions about, well, what about folks who maybe aren't on the tenure track? What about students of color? What about international students who maybe have language barrier issues? What about heritage students, whether they are African, African-American, Caribbean, or Latin American or Latino, right? How will they feel in this particular climate? And so I find that when I'm in these spaces and I ask these questions and I bring these things to light, oftentimes it's really me being the light of Jesus in terms of giving these people who often don't have the type of perspective that we have, a new way of viewing and a new way of thinking about what's going on at an institutional level, as well as thinking about how individual students may be impacted.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond. Do we have another person who'd like to just quickly chime in before we move on to the next question? Okay, all right. So given that all of these things that you're navigating in the academy, there's a lot of things that have been happening in the world right now. They're not new things, just different names, different dates. But how is this impacting you in doing your work as a scholar, doing your work as a Black man, doing your work as a Black woman? Could someone speak to that?
So I can address that as well briefly. So one of the things that I think is really important for society at large is to have an understanding of the history of people of African descent in the United States. And so this gets back to some of James's comments earlier, where we often find, just in general, again, as a historian, that most of my students know almost nothing about American history. They know almost nothing about world history. And so you can imagine, right, that they don't know anything about the history of Black or brown people in this country. And so when we think about that, that's something that's really critical, because oftentimes people view these events, so for example, the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, almost as a singular eruption or aberration. But really, we have to understand that this types of violence has been happening to Black bodies and brown bodies for centuries, right? And so oftentimes there's this tendency towards a presentism where many people, they say, well, I don't want to hear about Emmett Till and I don't want to hear about so and so. And I'm like, but you have to root these things in the history, because if you don't, then you have this magical thinking strain, right, where you're just like, well, this is just a singular incident, right? And if we can figure out what went wrong with this singular incident, then we can fix the problem. But the thing is, many of these issues are historic, right? And they're systemic. And if you don't understand the history, then you won't know how to dismantle the system, and you won't know how others who've gone before you have also attempted to dismantle the system.
That's a lot to think about, Dr. Hammond. Thank you so much. All right, so that leads us into our 5th question. Consider the following phrases: imposter syndrome, cultural taxation, hidden labor. What comes to mind for you?
Soft ways of saying racism. I think that all of these are more digestible forms of not addressing the core root of racist history that Dr. Lauren just talked about. Imposter syndrome to my understanding, is this idea that if you get to a place of higher education or in any particular place that there's a high esteem, you feel as if you don't belong there. Right? You know, maybe in graduate school, you feel like maybe you're not smart enough. I went through this when I got to the master's program. I was like, did they know who they really accepted? Like once after that first class or after the first semester, I'm gonna be exposed. And to be honest, you know, like most of the fools that I know, I met in college. Like, I mean, some of the most ignorant people I know are in college. And so these racist forms tell me that even though I've had to do so much more to get to this space, I'm still not uncertain. And so I have this ongoing uncertainty I'm trying to push back against and navigate. Cultural tax, you know, that's the emotional weight. You know, should I wear my hair a certain way? Should I speak a certain way? Should I eat this food in these places? Should I, you know, eat my lunch in my office because I like chicken and people going, you know, associate stereotypes. So all of this to me are softer ways of saying implicit bias. You know, I think there's a softer way of not dealing with the core issue of racism. And, you know, it's kind of connected to the last question. I'll try to keep this somewhat short. Like the coronavirus pandemic, when it became clear that, you know, it was Black folks who were dying mostly and older folks, all of a sudden we wasn't to reopen, right? And so, and the same thing with these murders, it's like, you know, these are Black people in particular who were being treated as less than and not being allowed to go through to the justice system that we set up. They don't get a chance to go through that. They just get killed. And so all of these things, I think, are the consequences of what Dr. Lauren said, just reinforcing it, like not knowing history, not knowing, you know, how we're repeating the same thing. These are cyclic things. You know, it wasn't that long ago that Michael Brown was killed by an officer, that Trayvon Martin, right? So we can't even say just Emmett Till. We have recent incidents of cyclical things that we're unwilling to deal with. And I think particularly as a church, that's why we've been suffering a lot, because we have kept this outside of, again, our theology, and we see as important. And so, you know, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Holly. I also want a quick follow-up question if there's nobody else who wants to quickly speak, chime in.
Yeah, I was going to chime in quickly.
Okay,
You asked, among three phrases, hidden labor, what comes to mind? What comes to mind when I think of hidden labor is the unscheduled meetings in my office, trying to talk Black undergraduate students off the ledge. It's me at the end of the semester pulling the one Black student in my class to the side whose voice I don't even remember hearing from the first day, and asking her, hey, how are you doing? And having to ask it 4 times to finally get to a conversation that lasts for 90 minutes, right? And then now that mentoring relationship is going, and shout out to her, she just graduated, but like it's that, and there's no slot for that on my annual report. There's no slot for it. So I have to be very vigilant and be mentored around putting it in is there anything more you'd like to say? And breaking down, like, this is what my mentorship looks like. These are the students, here are their names, here's their profile. I'm the only Black professor they've ever had, or one of the 3. I'm the only one that was nice to them. And so kind of saying, like, in addition to my graduate students, in addition to my master's students, in addition to that, here is my tribe of folks that I am mentoring, and trying to also keep that load light, but having to be there for them. So I think that's what the hidden labor looks like. The imposter syndrome looks like the extra hours and cognitive load on the drive home, on the drive to work, rather, from home, and getting ready for that 9 a.m. faculty meeting and trying to put on my game face, right? It's me putting on my headphones from the walk to my car, from my car at the stadium all the way to the School of Ed, and kind of just arming myself, right? Whether I'm listening to Fred Hammond or Kanye West or whatever, right? Whatever I need to do to kind of get me hyped, you know, different days call for different things. And it's so the fighting of the imposter syndrome is to remind myself who I am on the way from the car into the space. So that way I don't have to worry about, like, oh, I'm not supposed to be here. I just equip myself with things and people that tell me I'm supposed to be here and knock me upside the head with it when I forget. So those are the things that come to mind. And I think I want to make sure that's elevated and people understand what that means and what it looks like. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I have just a quick point that I'd like to add in terms of maybe just thinking about the imposter system in perhaps a slightly broader way. So for me, it's interesting in the sense that I don't necessarily find myself feeling as if I suffer from imposter syndrome, but I'll be transparent. And I'll say that that's because growing up as a young girl, the way that I was socialized was to think that I was ugly because I had brown skin. But what I was able to do is say, well, I know that society tells me that I'm unattractive, but they can't tell me that I'm not smart. Right. And so for me, I may not necessarily have the load in terms of thinking about the imposter syndrome, but there is a different kind of weight, right, that actually propelled me into the position that I am in today, right, which is a socialization around Black women, Black women's worth, and Black women's beauty, right, that I think is something that's often not talked about. The other thing I wanted to note is when we think about these ideas of hidden labor, you know, as Chauncey was saying, yes, it's I have a Black student or a student of color in my office for 90 minutes unloading, and it's the how do I get hype when I'm getting ready to go to work, but it's also the debriefing, right, and the decompressing and the wrestling with our own emotions as you have to wrestle with the fact that, wow, this student that I'm walking with, this student that I'm ministering to, or this student that I'm advising and shepherding is being crushed and destroyed, right, by the systems that are around them. So that's an emotional labor that we deal with, in addition to having to process incidents that happen to us personally on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think too, just to echo everyone else here, when I think of an imposter syndrome, I think about my own personal experiences. So from elementary school all the way up through grad school, I was always in predominantly white institutions. And the messages, whether inherent or covert, if you will, those subtle jabs that you get that tell you that you don't belong, that tell you that you got this because of X, Y, or Z reason, people seem to find ways to explain away the accolades or the achievements or the success that you have gotten. So for me personally, after, for example, receiving a fellowship, I had a professor walk up to me telling me, you know, well, I hope you live up to those expectations, give it a year. Or have someone else tell me, like, you only got this for this reason. Or when I got awarded my fellowship, I had someone tell me, well, you only got this because you're Black, and the only reason they want you there is for this reason. So year after year, having these messages perpetuated, you almost begin to internalize it until you find a tribe like Chauncey was speaking to that helps you disrupt or break that system, right? So for me, it's been this ongoing journey of trying to understand that I am way beyond what other folks have tried to box me in, right? And Christ has called me to do well beyond what they have called me to do. And that for me has just been so powerful and so freeing and liberating to where I can define myself not by how people define me, but how Christ defines me.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. All right, so it seems it's so hard to get all of these good questions and all of these responses in. I wish we had more time, but we're gonna keep going with these questions. So we're moving into recommendations right now. So I'd like to hear from all of the panelists, 1 to 2 sentences for these recommendations. I would love to get your insight. I know that our attendees would love to hear and learn from your expertise. So given that Black Americans remain the most religious out of all racial and ethnic groups to date in the United States, based on your personal and professional experiences, what suggestions do you have for scholars who are interested in studying the role of faith when it comes to things like health disparities, human development, history, psychology? Yeah.
So I could start off with this one. And I think, Meredith, you've correctly stated that in terms of religiosity, religious participation, prayer, etc., Black Americans or Black people in general usually have higher rates of participation. I think in this sort of, post-COVID era, we need to, transcend towards sort of being doers of the word, right? And so one of the things that I've been wrestling with and trying my best to focus on is action the Lord to sort of, teach me how to number my days, right? So there's, several scriptures that talked about this. And I think we really have to come to terms with, time is moving by so quickly. For many of us, life is seeming like things are really short, especially as we're watching these events on TV, looking at the ages of the people that have, recently passed away, both in our family from COVID, but as well as the racial, tensions, police shootings. You look at many of them and they're all young, right? And so when you think of what are we here to do? I think really we should be searching ourselves in this time and really praying for the wisdom to identify our purpose and the strength to really, do what we are called here to do in those spaces, because it's, again, the times are, really short these days, and we really need to find a way to get all that we were put here on the earth for, to get it done.
Thank you, Dr. Ransom. Okay, could I get one more person to respond? I know we have a lot of questions from people coming in, so I want to make sure we can answer as many audience participation questions as possible.
I have one quick thing for scholars.
Okay, awesome.
In your theory development, simply don't be shy about including the work of critical theological work by Black theologians, right? Think about liberation theology, think about womanism, and kind of blending that in with intersectional frames. Don't be shy about including that, right? If that's important to the Black experience, then let's kind of be intentional about that. And shout out to my graduate students, Paris Ball and Edward Scott, who are actually including some theological lenses in their work, whether it's their exams or their pre-dissertations. They're doing some really, really great work and trying to center the ways in which Black families and Black folk center the spirit. So yeah, just want to include that.
Thank you so much. All right, our next question is, what recommendations do you have for families, communities of faith, and other stakeholders interested in addressing religious and racial identity for Black youth? Remember, for the sake of time, please keep it really short.
So I'll jump in really quickly here and just say, I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that while everybody has wounds, people of African descent in the United States have specific wounds that are rooted, related to race-based slavery, Jim Crow and segregation, as well as racial terrorism. And we really have to come to grips with that history, and we have to know that history, because you can't have healing without understanding the history that was going on. Oftentimes people want to jump over the history and just get to, well, let's come up with some solutions. But no, we really need to sit, we need to look, we need to gaze intently in the same way, right, that James calls us to gaze into the mirror of scripture, right? Not a brief look and glance and let's now figure it out. And I think that one of the ways that we can do that, right, is by teaching the history. And we can use the Black church as a space and as a vehicle to do that. I actually had the opportunity to do that this winter, where I taught an 8-week course in my church on Black history, but I coupled the discipline of history with the discipline of prayer, so that the parishioners, right, would have the opportunity to move towards forgiveness, move towards healing, and move towards a greater sense of freedom. So I think you got to know the history and know it deeply. You can't just skip over it.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond.
I'll jump in here real quick. As a youth development scholar, I have it right here in my notes, and with 4 exclamation points: center youth voice. One of the most powerful things my elders asked me when I was younger and doing youth development programming and doing youth ministry, they asked me, what do you want for yourself, your family, your community, and your church? That question not only grounded my investment in my faith community and my own faith, but it launched my career. Like, I do what I do now because of them asking me simply that radical question: what do you want? And so to that point, we have to, and there's a science to this, right? So work with your youth development scholars. Shout out to all of us, right? We have to get used to not only developing youth capacity for voice, but also developing our capacity to hear them when they speak. We have to understand the science of asking the right questions, developing that voice, and then in doing that, whether it's within a youth ministry context, whether it's a broader church context, schools, community programs, college, all of that, right? If we can start to hone those tools and develop those skills, we'll be great. So that's my main recommendation always, and forever, youth voice.
Thank you so much. All right.
I would completely 100% agree with, we have to know our history and we have to figure out where our information is coming from. We can't develop programs to heal wounds without understanding what wounds we're trying to heal and where they came from. And I will also say, just from my own personal experiences, I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, so a very segregated place on Sundays. And one of the things I found very interesting is how different the messages are on Sundays that you receive from Black churches and white churches, and how very, very rare it is to find interracial church and the messages that happen there. So I think it's also important to figure out how we're having conversations that bridge these two spaces. because we as Black folks understand our problem, but the white churches, there's traditionally, unfortunately, there's a lot that can be desired, right? That leaves a lot to have conversations that need to be had. So one of the things I think is also really important is trying to understand how we can move the needle in terms of the understanding so that Sunday does not remain as segregated as it does, and the messages don't remain as disparate as they do.
All right, thank you so much. Great stuff.
Can I be quick? I'll be quick. 1 minute less. So I think we're talking about Black families. I encourage parents to talk to their kids about racism early and often. Oftentimes they feel like it would do damage if they talk to them, but I actually think it better prepares them. So some resources, one, The Conscious Kid, they have a social media page, Instagram, Twitter, all those type of things. And also Ibram Kendi has Anti-Racist Baby and Stamp from the Beginning, Young Adult Version. So those are just few quick resources, but many others are out there.
Thank you.
And shout out to Rihanna Anderson, who does racial socialization work, and Sean Jones and all those folks as well who are doing that exact work that you talked about, James.
Great recommendations. And we will, and to our audience, we are developing a resource list, you can sign up for if you click the link. But we'll want to honor your time and the panelists' time. So I'm going to segue into our last few questions before we start answering audience participation questions. What recommendations do you have for the Academy and for your field, or for non-Black viewers or scholars in the Academy or your field?
So I'll just say briefly, work can't be up to us, right? So as scholars of color, we already do a lot and we already bear a lot of the cost. And so we need those who are interested in partnering with us from other backgrounds, and particularly those from other backgrounds who are also people of faith, to be willing to do some digging into themselves, to do some self-examination, to get educated, right? There, as Dr. Hope said, we'll have a list of resources, right? Don't just, yes, listen to us and hear what it is that we're saying, but then go and do the additional reading so that you can be educated. Sit with that pain and then act, right? Don't act out of a lack of knowledge just because you feel uncomfortable, right? I think that's something I've been telling a lot of people to do. Oftentimes when we feel uncomfortable, it's an immediate reaction of, well, how do I fix this? Or how I'm defensive, right? Put all that down, the defensiveness and the how can I fix this? Sit, listen, learn, examine yourself, and then act.
Thank you. Do we have one more person? Okay. All right. So the next question is, what recommendations do you have for Black graduate students or Black youth who may be watching this, or other youth of color or other graduate students who may be watching this? What would you say to them?
I'll go quickly. Be in community with one another. I think one of the many tools in the very vast toolkit of the oppressor is separation, right? So Black folk thrive in community. We thrive when we're together. So don't be writing that dissertation alone, right? Find some folks to help you get it launched. Don't be writing, or don't be doing that kind of like critical youth activism work by yourself. Have a crew with you, right? So be in community. I'll be brief. Thanks.
Thanks. Anybody else?
I would say for graduate students that it's really important for you to figure out pieces of this identity stuff that we've been talking about and how you want to utilize your time. So I think for me, it was like my third year in grad school when I finally was at this place of like, I don't want to only be a good scholar or a good researcher or a good clinician. I want to be a holistic person. I want to be a good daughter. I want to be a good friend. I want to be a good sister. And so I think that it's important for us to take that time, whether it's in our faith space, in our quiet time or whatever, to kind of really sit and think about how do we want to balance some of those things, and to understand that your whole identity or your worth or your value is not based on these, like how many publications you have or what fellowship you got or what grant you got. And that, you know, the real gift of like the process of graduate school, I think, is just like learning yourself in the space of your identity and again, showing up as your most like true self.
Thank you, Dr. Busby. Do we have anybody else, or can we move into audience questions? Let me know what everybody's ready for.
So I'll say, Go ahead, Yusuf. Yes.
So I would just sort of follow up on Danielle. I think one of the things I'd say is really seek knowledge and seek it earnestly and early, right? And so that, because that's a long process, and I'm just thinking I'm in my third year in academia, and much of the growth that I've experienced really came at a later point in my life. And I think, in hindsight, just seeing the resources and stuff that we have, I think, starting that journey early would really help prepare you for where you need to go. So seek knowledge early and earnestly.
I'll piggyback on that briefly. So in seeking knowledge, really thinking about the Word of God and training yourself how to rightly divide it, right? Be a theologian, learn doctrine, really be in the Word, and understand that that's not something only for pastors, right? Or for deacons or elders, right? That's something for all of us as believers. And to start doing that early. So parents, if you have young kids, teach them what the Word of God says and teach them how to study the Word of God for themselves from a very early age.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond. Lots to think about, lots of perspectives. We're going to segue into our time of audience engagement. Panelists, thank you for sharing your expertise, your unique insight, and your bandwidth with us today. I know this was extra labor for you to be here, and so I just want to thank you so much for giving us all of the gifts and the talents that you brought into this space with you. As we move into the next part of our time together, please keep your responses and very, very short, because we want to get to as many questions as possible, and we want to get a diverse range of your perspectives. So the first question is, this is from, I think it's from a graduate student. How have you responded to microaggressions in your professional role? And what would you suggest for other academics and other professionals to handle those situations when they're experiencing a microaggression?
I would say for me, whenever I have experienced microaggressions in the academy or even in the therapy room, I just try to name it. I try to name it as it's happening, or I call it out. And that's if I have the capacity to do it. So I think it's always important to know like how much you have to give in a specific moment around something. Like, am I about to go into that with them? Am I about to make this make me upset? And I think I kind of have that decision point of like, is it bothering me enough that I'm gonna name it and I'm gonna just call it out in the moment? Or is it something that I'm fine with like sitting on because I don't have the capacity in that moment and I'm gonna have to just deal with it later?
Yeah, I'll piggyback off that. I think it's also important to recognize, especially if this came from a graduate student, just the power differential that might be there and who it might be coming from. So as a graduate student, I had an advisor who was a ride or die. Like, shout out to Dr. Enrique Neblett, who just was there for me at every step of the way and would take on some of that battle for me and would let me know, yes, Donte, this is something that you can talk through, or I got you, don't even worry about it. So again, back to that tribe, who can you have help you take some of that battle away? And if you're going to fight it, who can back you up when you do it?
I'll jump in really quickly. Be kind to yourself. There's so many times when I get home and I realize an hour ago that was a microaggression. I'm like, dang it. Like, I should have said blah, blah, blah. You start rehearsing. You have to like also forgive yourself and recognize that you're developing your own lens for these things. So even like, I think a kind of a pre-step one, or maybe a step one altogether, is to recognize that you're still learning, and that unfortunately you have to like learn how to code these things and kind of decode these things. And so it can be really, really, really tough to know upfront. So be kind to yourself on the back end of it.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. A second question from another participant. How do you deal with feeling like you're a representative of your community, given the general lack of diversity in the academy? Do you feel an unjustified sense of responsibility of having to represent your gender, race, ethnicity, or faith?
So I'll respond to that briefly. I think, I see it, as a real opportunity and as a blessing. So I think, for many of us, we touched on it earlier on, the imposter syndromes, et cetera. But I think it's important that we also see ourselves as having a unique opportunity that not many people have a chance to do. So I think, finding that way to feel empowered and knowing that you, at least perhaps the first or the second or third, that you're going to make a difference and that you're going to be able to provide something that, can be, to be an example that others can follow. So I think it's framing a perspective of why you're there, not necessarily seeing it as a burden, but figuring out the best that you have while you're there.
Thank you,
So
Dr.
So I think many of us know, as Yusuf is saying, that it can be a blessing in many different ways, but it can also at times be a burden. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves about that. But I think we also have to learn how to manage the burden in ways that line up with our capacity. And one of the things that you have to learn to do is how to say no. Now, depending upon where you are in your career, who you are in terms of where you're located in your department, what institution you're at, you may have greater or lesser ability to say no. But when you have the chance to say no, because you may feel like you're being trotted out, right, as an example of diversity in order to make the institution look good, if you have the power to say no because you feel uncomfortable, then do that.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond. We have a third question. Have you experienced any conflict between your faith and expectations placed on you as a Black member of the academic community?
So I'll say that I've maybe had this a few times, but it tends to manifest itself in political discussions. And so I don't want to get too deep into that. But one thing that I will say is that because Blackness, right, is the body that I inhabit, right, I don't necessarily always have a cross on, so people may not necessarily recognize or know that I'm a Christian in every space that I'm in, but they do always know that I'm Black. And so because of that, they always assume that I have particular ideological and political beliefs. And they expect me to act in ways that would perhaps edify a particular type of liberal ethos, I think, that permeates the academy, that at times is actually anathema or at cross purposes to being a Christian. So I think we have to be careful and just be aware of that as well.
Thank you. Would somebody else like to contribute? Add another thought? Okay. Well, we'll go to our fourth question. So we have a question from a medical student. So in the context of training medical professionals, what recommendations would you give to them to create a more inclusive doctor-patient relationship? Things that they might want to know. There's a lot of different ways we can speak on this, especially given the fact that we're dealing with a pandemic. We're always dealing with racial health disparities. So anybody want to speak into that, that would be great.
I think some examples of ways in which people can really pour into the training around these issues are to make it so that it's not this addition to whatever the standard training is, but it is integrated throughout how one thinks about their profession. And so I think a lot of times in my experiences, it's sort of like a week given to certain diversity related issues or particular training opportunities that are just very specific in the month of February, for example. And I don't feel like it's always integrated throughout the system or really integrated throughout each type of case that, you know, the students may be experiencing. So that's one recommendation.
I also think it's important for folks to educate themselves and to, again, I'm a historian, right, but to know the history of medicine and the ways in which medicine and medical fields have interacted with Black and brown bodies. And so I have a book recommendation. The book is called Medical Apartheid: The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. And the author is Harriet A. Washington. And the reason I think that that is important is because oftentimes folks know about the Tuskegee experience or experiment, but there are many other instances where we can see race and racial disparities in the medical field, including things like gynecology, right, which is an area that's of a particular sensitivity, right, and trouble for Black women. So again, I think going to the history and knowing that just because it's medicine and just because it's science doesn't mean it's objective. Race and racism influence those things. And I think you'll get a great view of that in that particular text.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond. Would anybody else like to chime in?
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. I also think, especially for medical students and in psychology, there's this phenomenon happening where students are more woke than their supervisors or the people above them. And I think this really reflects the lack of diversity and inclusion that we see in positions of power. And I think it's a lot of top-down training that we see. The things that the people up top prioritize are what the people at the bottom get. So I think this also reflects issues that we don't see being emphasized within training, because that's not something that they emphasize within their training, and not something that they emphasize when they were being trained as well. So I think this also reflects something that is more systemic in nature as well, that there's not a lot of this thing that are being highlighted or emphasized within training, and needs to also be emphasized within the top down.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. All right, so we have one last question. Is there anything else you would like to share with us that we didn't ask you today?
I'll go ahead and start us off. Something that's helped me through every step of my way is stay in your lane. For me, that has rang true to me in ways that I can't even communicate here, because it's helped me in my faith. It's helped me with my research. It's helped me be true to myself, regardless of the messages that are happening around me. And I think being underrepresented, being one of the few people of color in my department at all times, I've had my research being told it's not important. Why not this? Why not think about that? But that idea of stay in your lane for me has just been so reinforcing, and it's helped me to really lift up the voices that I seek to validate.
I would say that I think it's so important to, like how we talked about earlier, about having these different standards for having clear standards for what you really want out of your academic career, out of your professional career, personal life, whatever, and letting those things really guide you. I think to me, throughout this discussion, as we've talked about identity in so many different ways, I think that really allowing the intersection of your identities to exist. And so really, even though I know in the academy, there are so many reasons that come up against you for why it can be difficult to do so, or why it's not always beneficial to do so. But when we kind of talk about these wellness, thinking about wellness and thinking about health, I think it's really important to show up in that way. So that would be my addition.
So I would say that it may be important for folks to approach these things, as I was saying. So I approach much of what I do as a ministry, right? So think about what you're doing as vocation, right? Where your spiritual is meeting your job or your career path, and remember that we are always representing the gospel, and that we're always ministering in some form. And I'd also just leave folks with Micah 6:8, and I'll just read that briefly from the NIV. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justice, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
I'll say that my hope is that we can move to a space of healing from racism. I think, one of the names of God is Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals. And I think I echo a lot of what Dr. Lauren said, like education is key. And I feel like once we get the education, we need to move from healing, really unlearning some things as well. And I feel like a lot of the discussions or conflicts that we have is because we didn't really know how to aspire towards healing. Like anti-racism is excellent. We need that, right? Like highlighting anti-Blackness and things like that. But healing is that ultimate step, even beyond liberation. Like we can't fully be liberated if we're not whole in and of ourselves. And so I think, if folks can reframe, how do we get to healing to, realize how, and if you're a part of the, for white folks, that means looking at, how whiteness oppresses and how do you disband yourself from that. If you're from a group of Blackness that you've been oppressed throughout history, how do you overcome those things and reinforce and learn what was valuable from your ancestors, what they did to navigate those spaces?
Thank you. And I'll sort of echo and build upon what the panelists shared. And really, don't be afraid to slow down, right? And I talk a lot about introspection and a lot about reflection. I think, sometimes to really be able to help others and to contribute to the cause, you really have to be a whole person, right? So you talked a lot about healing, James. And I think, for many of us, it has to start within, right? And so don't be afraid to slow down, even though there are things that may seem pressing, whether it's that deadline or whether it's that email you need to respond to someone, just really think about it and reflect, how is this, centering with who you are as a person? How has it centered with your faith? And really just take that time to respond in a way that really reflects your values as a person of God. And last thing I'll say is just, trust your walk and your faith with God. That's the only thing that really can keep you through all of these things. And so these two things I found really essential: slowing down and trusting your walk and faith with God.
In this moment, am kind of like recalling one of the things that my advisor said to me. My advisor is very notorious for not saying that much. But every time I would go out in the field, and I was like, doing research, I was doing really, really hard stuff. And I was doing a lot of it by myself. And it was really terrifying at times and really anxiety provoking. And I would leave his office, he'd be like, have fun. And I was like, man, what are you talking about? Have fun, And then I think now I get it, right? Like, I'll lean into this thing. Find the corner of your personal and professional work that is fun and prosper there, right? Like, have fun. Like, I know that we do a lot of like heavy work, right? Like, whether it's healing, like we over here healing racism, we're over here kind of like thinking through new public health imaginations, we're being historians, we're doing all these things that require not only just heavy content, but also just heavy amounts of our time. We have to navigate heavy things. But man, every time I work with the right collaborator and we get into a groove on a paragraph, or we're kind of relating, or we're just laughing, like I've had so many moments with my students over the past year where I'm just like, this is fun. This is why I did it. This is why I started, right? And so I'm trying to like encourage myself to find that corner of the work, whether it's being in that special part of the data, whether it's writing, find that corner, dwell there, right? Because I think that God is there. The Holy Spirit is like feeding you there. So find that corner that is fun in your personal professional work, right? The workout that challenges you and makes you happy, right? Find it, have fun with it, prosper, move forward, because the world is not prescribing fun for Black folks. So we got to get it how we get it, right? Happy Juneteenth, y'all.
All right. Thank you so much. What a powerful session. I don't know about you, but these stories, these experiences, I wish we could keep going, but we want to honor your time. So first, let me just say thank you so much to all of you who have joined us. No matter whether you're in the academy, you're in another community, you're Black, you're not Black, we're so happy that you are here with us to celebrate Juneteenth and to hear from us. And we hope that this will be something that you share with your communities, things that you've learned. I first want to say, join me in thanking our panelists. I'm in awe of the pathways of justice, hope, and truth-telling that they have individually walked in order to shepherd us into this moment. I also hope that you will join me in remembering and honoring the Black Americans whose scholarship did not fully take shape in the academy due to restrictions, injustice. We want to remember those who started but could not finish, and those who wanted to start but were not allowed to enroll. All of the things that we've missed out on due to systematic racism and injustice in this country. Join me in remembering those who fought and continue to fight that we might have this platform to speak and to learn together today. Join me in honoring the communities that have shaped us, the intersectional communities, the different places where we come from. Join me in honoring those and remembering those communities. We honor the heritage that for many of us on this panel do not have records, and for many of our fellow African Americans and other Black Americans, we simply don't know where we came from. But in celebration of who we are right now and where we've been, we honor the spirit of this session, who has equipped us for this work, called us by his name, making us image bearers, justice seekers, and truth tellers. To you, our audience, I invite you to fill out the link above to receive a resource list that we're putting together that will reflect the topics discussed here during this session. We ask that you would share what you have learned when you receive this resource list with your communities. In this, I have two hopes. One, that all of us and all of you can learn and work together to cultivate unobscured pathways of equity and hope for Black Americans and all those who experience injustice in whatever form, that they may pursue their goals and thrive and live. Two, that all of us and all of you will continue to explore the vast and numerous ways our worlds have shaped us. May the conclusions we come to about our world be born out of wholeness. And may we reframe and position our wounds to be extant guides forward towards a better way to live, to see, to work, to hear, to collaborate, and to be. Happy Juneteenth. May peace be with you.